Order!
I can use this. How do you open it? Is it open?
It's good. You just speak normal.
Okay. 这经中高阳这是个
I would like to say a prayer for the legislation here. I know that our people are listening to us.
I asked the elders up there to join me when I pray, and I'm going to say a short prayer the way we always pray. And I've been here in this house many, many times, my friend, and I know the Premier well. I worked with the Premier when I used to work with E&R when I was the Grand Chief, and so I shook hands with him, and I told him I haven't seen him for a long time. But I just want to say that it's good to be back in here. I haven't been in here a long time, but don't forget that you're in the eyes of the public. Someone's always watching you all the time. But when I pray, I'm going to ask the Creator to help every one of you that's here so that people can work together. That's what we always do. Our elders are always telling us, when we start a meeting, always pray. Things will pan out, work for you. He's there watching us all the time. That's how the elders always talk to us. And I'll pray in my own way, and you can shut your eyes and ask the Creator to help you as a government, because we need you guys as a government. We need government to govern our country, our people. Everything is out there. It needs a government, and that's who you are. So I'll pray for you in my own language.
Know that I'd like to say a prayer for all the members and the regular members, and also the staff, and also the ministers and the speaker, and help them to work together and to support one another, and help them to be like one. So I would like to say a prayer now. So I would like to pray.
Prayers, pray in your own way that you guys used to do every morning before you start this meeting. So I'll just start my own prayer. Tungo ke chawo chine wona hunde, iyi ke ne ke chago chine go wona hunde, chin won chago ne ti, ho chingo ne wane le ti antene de, ne da ne be mari, no chine wone tone je wo on, arjun se ko da tone te di je jine tone wo lande, te ga mari, da mone le ne se kande, ho je ne ga te la se de no ti antene de, ona e san se jine de, Etabi chu dan zon chu da kwe da konte inda wo ke tau les da konte a uti anten de etabi chu dan zon chu visita uti anten de. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much.
Masicho.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Colleagues, I'd like to draw your attention to the visitors in the gallery at this time. We have with us two elders from Bishakon. Nawal Drybon is here with us, and Louis Frankie from Bishakon, two of the respected elders of my community of Bishakon, and also with us Richard Charlo, my CA. Welcome to our assembly. Masi. We also have former Grand Chief Joe Rabiscus, the son that's here with us as well. I'd like to thank him for coming as well. Minister's statement. Minister Akwitlan Goodani, the Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, over the last 5 years, the Government of the Northwest Territories has worked in partnership with people and organizations across the Northwest Territories to better understand and meaningfully address the root cause of poverty in this territory. This outreach supports our mandate commitment to reduce poverty in the Northwest Territories. In 2013, the N.W.T released a Building on the Strengths of Northerners, a strategic framework towards the elimination of poverty in the Northwest Territories. The development of this framework is a collaborative effort between our government, Indigenous governments, and the business and non-profit sectors. It is a guiding document for all the work that has been carried out since its release, including the development of a N.W.T action plan and multi-stakeholder territorial anti-poverty action plan, as well as annual roundtables to bring all partners together, significant new investments, and innovative new programs and services in communities across the Northwest Territories. Next week, the 6th Anti-Poverty Roundtable will be held in Hay River, continuing my commitment to host these annual meetings in a different region each year to help partners better understand the unique context of poverty throughout the territory. Mr. Speaker, the Roundtable will focus on 2 critical pieces of work: informing the development of a progress report on the strategic framework towards eliminating poverty since its release 5 years ago, and working to develop a renewed territorial anti-poverty action plan to guide our work moving forward. Co-creating these documents with involvement from all partners is critical to respecting the collaborative model we have embraced in our poverty reduction efforts. Mr. Speaker, this commitment to working together is foundational to how we have chosen to address poverty. The Territorial Anti-Poverty Action Plan, released in 2015, sets out 3 principles for action. Respect and equality are essential to anti-poverty work. People are our most important resource, and how we do things is as important as what we do. Elder Paul Andrew has said, and I quote, "We didn't know we were poor until the government told us we were, and no one was homeless until someone told us we had to live in a house." End quote. The N.W.T is an essential leadership role in addressing poverty, there is no question. We also have a responsibility to carry out the role with humility, especially cultural humility, recognizing that people and communities are best able to drive solutions that are based on their lived experience and understanding, and informed by the needs and priorities they articulate for themselves. Mr. Speaker, poverty is not an Indigenous issue, but Indigenous people living in the Northwest Territories continue to be disproportionately impacted by poverty and the negative health and social outcomes associated with it. This is a direct result of colonial policies that have removed people from the land that sustain them, forcing them to adopt to life in settled communities, residential schools, and other institutional environments. Investments in community health and wellness, mental health and addictions, and opportunities to reconnect to the land and culture have been essential elements of our work to address poverty and address the legacy of colonization. Addressing the wrongs of the past and helping to create healthy, hopeful futures begins with and will be sustained by personal development, wellness, and well-being of all Northern people. Mr. Speaker, one of the tools that we have established as part of our approach to eliminating poverty in partnership with our communities and partners is the Anti-Poverty Fund. Since the Anti-Poverty Fund was established in 2014, it is conservatively estimated that 13,000 people have been touched by the program and its supports. Over the years, youth and families have been the most frequent recipients of the program supports. Women, persons with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, and elders have also benefited from targeted programming. These efforts are essential to breaking the cycle of poverty for individuals and from generation to generation. This year, the $1 million Anti-Poverty Fund has been allocated towards more than 40 projects across the Northwest Territories. Through the fund, food security for children, elders, and those in need is being immediately addressed with meal and snack programs as well as soup kitchens. It will also support longer-term solutions by investing in initiatives such as community gardens, traditional harvesting programs, and training for small-scale agricultural and poultry production. Employment and life skills, including traditional and cultural skills, are being supported by programs all over the territories, including the Tlicho government's Dene Warriors program, the Hay River Committee for Persons with Disabilities Life Skills Employment Action Program, and the Decho Friendship Center's Community Helper Program. Housing is being addressed through numerous programs ranging from emergency shelters to rapid rehousing projects, Housing First programs, and an extended stay program to provide extra support for women and children in crisis. Mr. Speaker, These projects, led by community partners with financial support from our government, are examples that show how we are working together to alleviate the effects of poverty in the short term while meaningfully addressing the root causes of poverty in the long term. Poverty is not just an issue of income or economy. It cannot be solved by more jobs or better paying jobs if those opportunities are not accompanied by social policy that respects the dignity of those who are not able to work. Social and technological change everywhere is shifting the nature of work itself, and it is more important than ever that we find ways to invest in the creativity and ingenuity of Northern people to create their own opportunities, generate their own employment, and drive employment to community-based economies that are meaningful, sustainable, and grounded in culture and a way of life. There is much work yet to be done. The N.W.T is committed to ongoing leadership in the effort to address poverty in the Northwest Territories, and we are committed to continued collaboration and co-creation in the work that we do and the way that we do it. Today, I want to recognize the progress that has been made so far and acknowledge the sustained efforts of all partners, including my colleagues on both sides of this House, Indigenous and community governments, NGOs, and community service providers, and the business and philanthropic sectors that support our work. Thank you to all of them for their continued support to advance these programs and initiatives, and I look forward to working with you all in Hay River next week. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister statement. Minister Ike Gooden, the Minister, N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, access to housing continues to be one of the most serious issues for people in the Northwest Territories. Many new players coming to the table with new interests in addressing this need, and roles and responsibilities for housing delivery continue to change and evolve. Our government is committed to working with the other governments and other housing stakeholders to implement northern solutions for northern housing to help address our high cost of living. The federal government has come back on the scene with a potential long-term commitment under the National Housing Strategy. We are still negotiating with them on the final amount and how to use those resources. Indigenous governments are now taking more of an interest in housing delivery. Although no Indigenous governments have drawn down jurisdiction over housing, there have been offers for engagement and partnerships. Mr. Speaker, these shifting roles and some new resources offer an opportunity to reshape housing governance, partnership, and planning in the Northwest Territories. To set the stage for more multi-stakeholder involvement in housing projects, the Housing Corporation will be working with individual communities to undertake long-term housing planning in all 33 communities in the Northwest Territories. Housing plans will be developed through a partnership involving the Housing Corporation, the community, and other stakeholders with resources and information to offer. Mr. Speaker, our focus is to ensure that values and priorities communities have about their housing are reflected in their housing plans. By synthesizing community knowledge and perspectives with housing data and statistics, housing plans will form a comprehensive map to better direct federal and territorial governments, Indigenous governments, community governments, and private industry on future housing investments. Mr. Speaker, the Housing Corporation is also committed to working with communities to monitor these housing plans on an ongoing basis once they have been developed. The deliverables that communities can expect include a comprehensive community profile, a needs analysis, and a housing plan with goals and outcomes we can use to measure housing changes over time. Some areas housing plans will focus on include housing needs, housing demand, health, education, crime, economic information, available land, population growth, and other factors that support a comprehensive strategic planning document. Mr. Speaker, the Housing Corporation has undertaken discussions over the past 3 months with stakeholders in the government of the Northwest Territories, the federal government, Indigenous governments, and individual communities to start the first round of housing plans for this fiscal year. A community selection process has been established, including readiness criteria that are based on community interest and stakeholder input. Key criteria include a municipal community plan, committed leadership ready to lead the housing plan process, existing advisory or other committees, and potential to hire a local facilitator to engage the community, gather local feedback, and to help plan for a community housing forum. The Housing Corporation has presented this concept to the Clecho government and the Government of the Northwest Territories Housing Working Group. The Housing Corporation will be working with the Clecho representatives towards the development of community housing plans over the next year. My understanding is that Y.E.L.L.K.N.I.F.E. will be one of the first communities within the Clecho region to begin the housing plan process. The Housing Corporation met the week of October 15th with the community's leadership to seek formal approval and agreement to participate. The Housing Corporation has also presented this concept to the Delaunay-Gaultier government. The Delaunay leadership was anxious to proceed, and they will shortly be issuing a formal resolution to participate in this project. The Invalid Regional Corporation, the Gwich'in Tribal Council, and communities in the Sahtu and the South Slave regions have also expressed interest in starting plans. The Housing Corporation is targeting at least 4 communities, in addition to Delaunay and Y.E.L.K.N.I.F.E. to complete plans in the next 6 months. This is not planning for planning's sake, Mr. Speaker. Once the Government of the Northwest Territories and the federal government have come to an agreement under the National Housing Strategy, there will be further housing investment opportunities in all of our communities. The Housing Corporation will multiply this investment by stacking resources through its Community Housing Support Initiative, which has already seen the development of new housing in partnership with Indigenous governments such as the Salt River First Nations. Mr. Speaker, we have all heard the saying, nothing about us without us. The Housing Corporation's initiative to develop 33 community housing plans meets the spirit of that saying. Investment by all our housing stakeholders will be informed by and grounded in direct feedback from the community residents, ensuring that our resources are used in the most effective way to meet the community priorities. Masi Cho, Mr. Speaker.
Good Minister.
Masi. Minister statement. Minister Ike Godan, the Minister Infrastructure.
The Government of the Northwest Territories has made a mandate commitment to implement the 2030 energy strategy. This includes renewable and alternative energy solutions and actions that the Government of the Northwest Territories and our partners will undertake to meet targets for greenhouse gas reductions in heating and power generation, as well as our 10-year strategy for investing federal and other funds towards energy projects. Later today, I will table the Energy Initiatives Report 2017-2018, which provides an overview of the many energy initiatives completed last fiscal year by various government departments, Crown corporations, and partner agencies that support energy projects, programs, and services for our residents, communities, and Indigenous governments. Our collaborative approach in these initiatives allows us to make the most of limited resources and to achieve many of our mandate commitments. Last spring, the Government of Northwest Territories publicly released the 2030 Energy Strategy, along with the Climate Change Strategic Framework and the Northwest Territories Petroleum Resource Strategy. Together, these documents are defining our long-term vision and approach to energy and climate change and will enable the Northwest Territories to transition to a strong, healthy economy that is less dependent on fossil fuels. The 2017-18 Energy Initiatives Report supports the strategic objectives outlined in these 3 documents, which, Mr. Speaker, is a reassurance that we're on the right path. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to highlight some of the noteworthy accomplishments in the Energy Initiatives Report 2017-2018 and begin by sharing some of the projects that we advanced in the Government of the Northwest Territories' mandate commitment to continue to develop and advance initiatives to displace diesel generation in the Northwest Territories, including biomass energy projects. The Government of the Northwest Territories installed biomass boiler at École Allen St. Cyr School, which I toured earlier today. This system will meet nearly 100% of the heating needs of the school. The system will save 115,000 litres of diesel, or about $130,000, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 306 tonnes per year. The Government of the Northwest Territories also installed a 950 kilowatt biomass boiler at East 3 School in Inuvik, making that school the first N.W.T asset in the Beaufort Delta to install biomass heating. This system will offset 270,000 litres of propane, or equivalent to 410 tons of carbon dioxide. It will also provide an annual savings of close to $370,000. Last year, we also marked the 10th anniversary of the Government of Northwest Territories Capital Asset Refit Fund, also known as CARF. As members know, this program uses money saved through energy efficiency improvements to government buildings to further fund improvements. Over the last decade, CARF supported initiatives that have effectively reduced greenhouse gas emissions from the Government of Northwest Territories assets by over 10,000 tons annually, and have displaced an equivalent of 27 million litres of diesel fuel since the program's inception, representing a nearly 24% reduction in annual emissions. Mr. Speaker, our government is also fulfilling our mandate commitment to displace diesel generation through wind energy projects, including the proposed Inuvik High Point Wind Project, and assessing the feasibility of wind energy projects in other communities or regions. The Government of Northwest Territories is undertaking wind monitoring in Sax Harbor to better understand wind resource potential in the high Arctic. We are also undertaking wind monitoring and data collection in Norman Wells and collecting water flow information that could lead to a community-scale hydro project in partnership with the community of N.W.T. In the 2017-18, work continued on the Inuvik Wind Project as part of the 2030 energy strategy targeted to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from diesel electricity by 25% by the year 2030. To support this project, the Government of Northwest Territories has undertaken community outreach, including traditional knowledge and land use workshop in Inuvik with the Gwich'in and Inuit elders, land users, and youth. Mr. Speaker, looking forward, other strategic energy initiatives are taking place. For the first time, we have secured a long-term commitment from our federal partners to invest in energy infrastructure projects and incentive programs that are tailored to advance our policy objectives and deliver on our mandate commitments. This past March, the federal government committed to fund the Government of Northwest Territories with more than $570 million over the next 10 years under Investing in Canada plan. Approximately $350 million of that commitment will support the 2030 Energy Strategy and Energy Action Plan. Notable projects for which the Government of Northwest Territories submitted applications under the agreement include the mega-sized wind turbine project in Inuvik, overhauls to the aging Snare hydro system. We look forward to providing members with further updates on these projects in the very near future. Earlier this month, we also signed a $23 million funding agreement as part of the Federal Low Carbon Economy Leadership Fund. Part of this funding is being used to increase the Arctic Energy Alliance funding by approximately $9 million over 4 years. Remaining funds will be used to support the new government greenhouse gas grant program, which was announced earlier this month and will provide up to $1.8 million in grants per year for community governments to undertake greenhouse gas reduction projects. Mr. Speaker, the Energy Initiatives Report 2017-2018 is an excellent reference for those interested in learning how the Government of the Northwest Territories has linked broad policy objectives to community projects and to programs across the Northwest Territories over the last year, and how it is helping the 18th Legislative Assembly fulfill mandate commitments. Looking forward, we are focused on leveraging a significant federal investment that we have secured to advance and fulfill our mandate commitments, reducing our infrastructure gap, and ultimately improving the sustainability of our communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister statements. Minister Ike Gooden, the Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 6 community governments in the Northwest Territories had an election on October 15, 2018. These elections took place for all of our communities with city, towns, or village status, including the city of Yellowknife, the towns of Hay River, Fort Smith, Norman Wells, and Inuvik, and the village of Fort Simpson. There were 87 candidates in total, vying for 52 available seats. The large number of candidates shows that there is a keen interest in the local level of government and that individuals want to serve as leaders and decision makers for their community. Mr. Speaker, I am happy to report that our territory continues to benefit from gender parity at the local government level, with 4 of the 6 mayor positions taken by female candidates. In total, 26% of the total 87 candidates for municipal office were female, and 78% of those candidates were successful in their bid for election. The voter turnout rate was between 34% and 78% across the Northwest Territories. The lowest turnout rates were in communities where either the mayor or a council was acclaimed. 17% of candidates overall were acclaimed, with the mayor of Hay River and 8 councillor seats for the town of Inuvik not requiring a vote. Overall, the mayor position was well contested, with 2 to 4 candidates running for mayor in each of Yellowknife, Inuvik, Fort Smith, Northern Wells, and Fort Simpson. Local elections remain important to community residents. Being an elected official is one of the best ways that an individual can support their community in providing a safe, sustainable, and healthy environment for their residents. Congratulations to all who were elected on October the 15th, 2018, especially to the mayors. I look forward to working closely with Mayor Natasha Kolokowski in Inuvik, Mayor Frank Pope in Northern Wells, Mayor Sean Welly in Fort Simpson, Mayor Rebecca Alty in Yellowknife, Mayor Candace Jameson in Hay River, and Mayor Lynn Napier-Buckley in Fort Smith. Many thanks to all the candidates who ran in the 6 communities, whether they were successful or not. People's willingness to serve is what makes the democracy work, especially at the community level. I would also like to thank the staff and volunteers who not only led the election process on behalf of the municipalities, but also those who supported candidates with their campaigns. It takes a significant effort by many people to facilitate this process behind the scenes so that residents can exercise their right to vote in elections. Mr. Speaker, there will be an election for 9 Hamlet community governments on December 10th, 2018. During this election, there will be 35 positions to be filled. This will be an opportunity for aspiring candidates in those communities to run and for residents to choose their leadership and determine the future direction of their community. I encourage all qualified residents to put their names forward and especially to get out and vote. Masicho, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to speak about a good news success story stemming from the riding of Yellowknife North. It's a story of a good idea, hard work, and community partnerships that grew into a northern legend and thriving business. Mr. Speaker, today is the 30th anniversary of the establishment of Air Tindi. On November 1st, 1988, Peter and Alex Archuk and their wives Terry and Sheila, along with 8 employees and 3 aircraft, opened their new business. They loved aviation, loved the people of the North, and brought confidence and strong work ethic to their new airline. They started with seasonal tourism flights, wildlife surveys, and mining exploration, and grew from there. Over time, they earned loyalty and friendships among customers and communities by building a tradition of excellence, reliability, service, and safety. Starting in 1991, they have forged a total of 6 Aboriginal joint ventures. Continuously since 1993, Air Tindi has provided medevac services across the N.W.T. The diamond rush of the early 90s boosted the airline even further, leading to growth in business and the acquisition of more capable aircraft like the Dash 7. Today, Air Tindi employs 200 people, flying 18 aircraft. It provides vital daily connections between 5 communities and the capital. Its medevac crew is ready to be in the air anywhere in the N.W.T. within 45 minutes of getting a call. In 2017, they flew over 1,200 medevac missions. Air Tindi flies specialty charter missions of almost every description. It carried the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge to Blatchford Lake Lodge, dog teams to the Arctic Winter Games, and a load of piglets to Gamity for the community's local agricultural project. Mr. Speaker, like many northern businesses, Air Tindi has benefited from a focus on safety and best practices. This past year, it achieved 1 million hours and 3 full years operation without a lost time injury. The airline also grows its own northern workforce. About 30 apprentices or trainees are at Air Tindi at any given time, learning to be pilots or mechanical engineers. Mr. Speaker, Air Tindy is truly a northern success story. After 30 years, it continues to play a central role in transportation services in the N.W.T, providing a vital service and connecting northern communities and peoples. Colleagues, please join me in congratulating Air Tindy on its 30th anniversary in business. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Goden and the member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we conclude our capital planning session. Mr. Speaker, I recall growing up in the community of Cove Lake being mindful on the proposed new school facility. It gives me pleasure. Mr. Speaker, in those early days, we did not have a school in the community, therefore attended the Inuvik Residential School. Mr. Speaker, the Cove Lake First Nations built their own facility. Now, Mr. Speaker, the community children will soon be able to attend classes in a community participation designed facility and no longer have to whisper from behind panels made from bookshelves. Mr. Speaker, the community of Toledo held their first joint meeting with infrastructure on their design input involvement to their community health center, a true partnership approach by the Departments of Health and Social Services and Infrastructure. Both buildings, Mr. Speaker, will contribute to building and strengthening community-based education and health care. Mr. Speaker, advancing forward during 2019, I look forward to the community benefits by construction. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I would like to extend best wishes to all members for the remainder of 2018. Massey.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Goden and the member Kamlik.
Mr. Speaker, it has been nearly 100 years since the end of the First World War. Around the world, it is known as Armistice Day, Memorial Day, National Independence Day in Poland, and in the Commonwealth as Remembrance Day. November the 11th is a day for us to solemnly reflect upon the sacrifices made by those who preceded us, making a decision that many of us will hopefully never have to. Remembrance Day is a chance for us to show thanks to those who are to this day buried in lands not of their birth and far from their homes and families. It's an opportunity to share with those who are fortunate enough to have returned our thanks and reverence while remembering all of those who were left behind. Remembrance Day is not about the glorification of armed conflict. Rather, it is an opportunity for us to show reverence and respect for our elders who have made a decision harder than many of us will ever have to face, to go off beyond the horizon to defend that which they hold dear, to leave behind compatriots, and to return to a home having experience they can share with oh so few. Many returning veterans are burdened with traumas which few in the general public fully comprehend. Veterans should rightly be proud of their experience and achievements, and we, in the public, should not be allowed to have them forgotten. Mr. Speaker, I want to take this moment to ask all members of this House, as well as Northerners, to take a moment to reflect, however they best see fit, upon the sacrifices of veterans past, present, and future. We must never cease to show our gratitude to our servicemen and women, for every day these words still ring true. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member for Trinidad-Wolladay.
Mr. Speaker, today I'm going to talk about, they're talking about the carbon tax today, so I'm going to ask the minister. The tanks that are getting delivered into the communities, we're talking about it. They're saying that it was not to be taxed. The way they are working, I don't understand exactly what is going on. The people that deliver the fuel within a community or the boats that are delivering it. Maybe they're the ones that are paying the tax. The heating fuel, it is not supposed to be taxed for the people that are hunting, living on the land.
On a couple of questions that my constituents have over carbon tax. I know that some of the fuels will be exempt. I'll be asking the Minister of Finance about what fuels will be exempt. My understanding is maybe fuels that are needed to travel, but I'm not sure if that includes traveling on the land for individuals to go out hunting for the elders in the community, or if it's only specific to fuels that are used for boats and ships or airplanes for people who have to travel. In at least one of my communities, we have no highway, and then in 3 of the communities that I represent, there are highways and people use their vehicles to hunt. So I don't know if that means that there will be some sort of exemption on the gas that they purchase in order to go hunting.
And the people that are traveling, going out on the land to heal themselves, either by boat or skidoo, going to some of the cultural activities out on the land. And the gas that are being used for those trips and the skidoos, I don't understand if it's being taxed or not too. So I'm going to ask the Minister of Finance today. Thank you very much.
Masi. Member statement. Member Ike Godanende. Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Fiddle music came to the N.W.T. with the voyagers and has been ingrained in northern culture and music since the first traders. Angus Bolio, Stanley Lafferty, and Colin Adjun are some of the best known. But there are many other fine northern fiddlers. Cole Crook represented the next generation. Cole was much loved young fiddler known for his gentlemanly ways and selflessness, generosity of spirit. He was a deeply spiritual man who lived his Christian faith by sharing himself, his money, and means with whoever might need it. He spent much time with the elders observing their wisdom and teachings. Cole traveled from community to community, introducing children to the joy of fiddling and bringing the benefits of music to the youth of these communities. He led by example. With youth, Cole always had time to teach children how to fiddle, keep the music tradition alive. With elders, Cole helped them with their chores, listening to their stories, and maintain traditional values. All generations and ages were brought together through music he played. Cole's death on his way to a New Year's event in Toledo was a tragic loss felt by all those who knew him, met him, or heard his music. Cole passed on his joyful music, making generous spirit, and sharing the musical tradition lived on through the Cole Cooks Fiddle Association. They continue to change young people's lives forever through the music. Since 2003, the association has been actively continuing the work Cole did in so many of the communities. Youth and elders connecting in performance with the youth at the elder care centers are always a magical experience. Communities, concerts, where the whole family is toe-tapping, jigging, and laughing together. The annual January Jamboree in Fort Simpson brings nearly 100 fiddlers together for a fun-filled weekend of fiddling and dancing. The association has donated fiddles and taught in many N.W.T. communities over the years. They have established fiddle programs in 17 communities. The association has been moving forward on a wing and a prayer. A friend's kitchen became a fiddler's repair shop. The association's president kept a room in her home for teachers and lent out her car for teaching tours. Angus Doris Bolio donated accommodations. Buffalo Air donated free flights for the association teachers. This has been Art Council's and MACA's support for the Cole Cooks Fiddle Association, but much more each could be done with the help of this Assembly to support the organization fully. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike-Goodden and the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today is the opening season in the Beaufort Delta for trapping. Many people are very excited to go out on the land and continue our traditional way of life. Please be safe as our warmer temperatures and swift water can make the ice unsafe on our rivers, creeks, and lakes. As you begin to open up your trap lines and start setting traps. Mr. Speaker, it's pretty neat to see that my constituents continue to this day to bring their children with them and teach them our traditional way of life. Also, Mr. Speaker, we have some elders that are in their 70s and 80s that are still trapping to this day. They are true role models to our younger generation. That's teaching our next generation that through trapping, you can not only provide for your family, but also live a healthy way of life. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike-Goodden and the member Yellowknife Centre.
Massey, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the issue of carbon pricing and how to encourage reduced use of fossil fuels takes up a lot of space in our national debate, and of course it's a popular topic in this House as well. These are vital issues for many reasons. I'd like to give my assessment of where we are at in the N.W.T. and where we need to go. Cabinet announced details in July of a scheme that would meet the federal requirements of a carbon tax. Cabinet said it's made in the N.W.T. framework, takes into account our costs of living by establishing a system of immediate tax exemptions and cost of living rebates. To offset increased costs, the GNWT created a cost of living offset to refund the tax to individuals and families. I had hoped for a more comprehensive package of measures, including dramatic increases in rebates and incentives to improve the energy efficiency of homes and buildings. Increases to Energy Alliance programs have come thanks to new federal dollars. I applaud the GNWT's announcement this week of an additional $1.8 million under the new Government Greenhouse Gas Grant Program. That's progress, but we need more ambitious supports. I'm also convinced industry is willing to meet the low carbon challenge. The Canadian Mining Association is on the record in support of, quote, a broad-based carbon price that is applicable to all sectors of the Canadian economy, end quote. One of our mines took action more than a decade ago with a big investment in wind power generation because this makes economic sense. I believe the industry is willing to do more to meet shareholder demands that they take action on greenhouse gas emissions. As to the notion that carbon pricing is a job killer and stunts economic growth, the facts soundly refute this misconception. When I lend an ear to this issue in the N.W.T., I'm not hearing the public outcry about a carbon tax. I believe our residents have the learned and factual warnings of the extraordinary hardships facing our planet as a result of climate change, and they are willing to act. What's needed is inspirational leadership, not fearful hesitancy. For the sake of our children's future, we must keep our international promises and work towards a lower carbon future. I will be asking our government how they can better support our response to climate change. Massey.
Massey. Member statements. Member for Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on Tuesday, November 6th, Hay River's new town council will be sworn in. While there will be some familiar faces, 6 of the 9 members are newly elected. That means we'll be saying goodbye to quite a few people, and I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to Donnelly Junkin, Vince McKay, Jason Coquell, Roger Candow, and Mike Mahar for their service over the past 3 years. I especially have to thank our outgoing mayor, Brad Mapes, who has always been willing to work closely with me during my time as MLA so we could advance the interests of our community. I look forward to continuing this good working relationship with Mayor-elect Candace Jamieson, who I'd like to congratulate on her election by acclamation. Congratulations as well to returning councillors Steve Anderson and Keith Dowie, and newly elected councillors Robert Bouchard, Jeff Groenewegen, Emily Chambers, Linda Duford, Joe Melanson, and Brian Willows.
They will face many challenging issues in the coming years, including the power franchise decision, which will have ramifications for the entire territory, the economic growth that will be associated with Pine Point Mines, the pellet mill, the long-term care unit, and all the associated spin-offs, as well as our future population growth and land development issues. But I know they're up to the challenge, and I look forward to working with them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statements. Member statements. Member for Thabacha.
Mr. Speaker, people in Fort Smith and throughout the Northwest Territories were saddened to hear of the passing in St. Albert, Alberta, of Agnes Sutherland in August of this year at the age of 92. Sister Agnes Sutherland was born in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta in 1926 and joined the Grey Nuns in 1943, pronouncing her vows in 1946. She was a teacher in St. Albert, St. Paul, Fort McMurray, and Fort Smith, where she lived for many years. She also worked as a religious education specialist and found time to write several books. She was an advocate for women seeking shelter when fleeing abusive relationships and was a driving force in the establishment of a shelter in Fort Smith, which bears her name, Sutherland House. She was also a strong advocate for seniors and those with disabilities. She leaves many friends and admirers. Mr. Speaker, a long life, well lived. Thank you.
Our condolences to the family members and also to the community as well. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today in the House, we acknowledged the 30-year anniversary of Air Tindy. And today we have with us in the House, and I want to recognize them, President Al Martin, we have HR Manager Belinda Beck, and we have Vice President Trevor Weaver from Air Tindy. Welcome and thank you for being here.
Masi. So ha chungo ga kwe gi ke hu zai ke go down in the member in Inuvik Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to recognize my wife of 39 years, Judy McLeod, who provided me a lot of good advice, and she always reminded me to be nice in the Assembly. Sometimes I listen, sometimes I don't, but always glad to have you in the gallery. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Ha chungo ga kwe gi ke hu zai ke go down in the member in Inuvik Boot Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to welcome Judy as well, constituent of Inuvik Boot Lake, and always good to see you here in the proceedings and supporting and giving good advice to our member from the, representing the Inuvik Twin Lakes. Masi.
Ha chungo ga kwe gi ke hu zai in the ke go down Yellowknife Center.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today to introduce Mr. Trevin Yakalaya. He is a page from the Yellowknife Centre constituency, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank him for his service to the House and to all the pages who have been active in this sitting. Thank you.
Merci. Ha chungo ga kwe gi ke hu zai ke go down in the member Yellowknife South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to recognize a page from Yellowknife South, Rivka Peters, and also all the pages that have been here for the past 4 weeks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Ha chungo ga kwe gi ke hu zai ke go down in the member Thabacha.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to recognize 2 pages from Fort Smith, Finley Rutherford Simon and Madeline Minute, and I'd like to thank all of the pages for their work with us. Thank you.
Merci. Ha chungo ga kwe gi ke hu zai ke go down in the member South too.
Speaker, I too would like on our last day to thank the pages here that are helping us, including Mackenzie Menico and Abigail Sui from Delaney, and watching the proceedings here, also the staff behind the glasses here at translation, and Indio, our technician. Masi.
Masi. 하춘거 가게 끼고 흐자이 깨고 다니는데 멤버네 핸데.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to also recognize your CA, Richard Charlo, but we called him Little Richie back when, and then welcome to the Assembly. And thank you for doing a great job for the Minister. Thank you.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Grace Leaf.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to recognize somebody in the gallery. He's not a constituent of the riding, but I think he's been a great voice for the Northwest Territories for many, many years, a great voice for CBC, Mr. Randy Henderson.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for your indulgence. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Yellowknife North resident and the architect of our fine building, Mr. Gino Pin. Thank you.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Masi. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Trinity Willowday.
Marcy Cho, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Minister of Finance on the carbon tax. I know that their fuels are exempted from the carbon tax here in the Northwest Territories. I'd like to ask the Minister if he could just, for the people back home, for the constituents, if he could tell us exactly which fuels are exempted from carbon tax. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there was a lot of work done with Ottawa on the carbon pricing and the effect that it was going to have on the Northwest Territories. They've agreed with us that aviation fuel should be exempt, and I believe heating fuel as well will be exempt at the pump. And those are the two. And I was just checking on the gasoline to see if there was an exemption there. And so those are the two that we have for now. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Akira Cassie, member Trinity Willowday.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister if there will be tax rebates. We noticed that all of the jurisdictions that didn't do their own carbon tax system, were the federal carbon tax system was imposed upon them, but there were tax exemptions, and that was clear. I'd like to ask the Minister, there will be tax exemptions for the people of the territories as well. Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, gasoline will not be exempted at the pump, but I think they would have to file for that. But as far as the rebates go, recognizing the cost of the carbon pricing on people in Northwest Territories, and that was one of the things we heard the most of as we were touring the Northwest Territories with this particular issue. There will be rebates provided to residents in Northwest Territories using the Made in the North Made in the North approach to carbon pricing. Had we used a federal backstop, and I think I provided the table at one time, I'm in the process of putting that information together. I want to table that document. It's available online on the ENR website, our finance website, but I want to table that document so people in the territories know what it would cost us had we used a federal backstop, not the one that we proposed to the federal government, and good on them for accepting our approach to carbon pricing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tada, Cassie, member Trinity Willowday.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Minister for correcting me. I was calling it tax exemptions, but I meant tax rebates. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, on the fuels that are exempted, like heating fuels and aviation fuel, at some point, I think that both of those fuels would be produced in the south and hauled. So I want to ask the minister if the individuals that are hauling heating fuel, so like a trucking company, or as we buy the fuels off the rack, and then the transportation cost of that, I'd like to ask the minister if there is if carbon tax is imposed upon the people that are actually hauling the fuel to the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the challenges that we faced in the Northwest Territories, and we made it known to Ottawa, was a lot of the product that we have coming to the Territories has to be shipped into the Northwest Territories. We don't produce a lot of our own product, and they understood that. And my understanding is that those products that are coming in, they would have to pay carbon tax on that. And that's one of the reasons that when we came up with our Made in the N.W.T approach, we thought it would be easier for our residents if we rebated those. We rebated the heating fuel and at the pumps, and then as well as the aviation fuel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. Council Member Tunade Wolode.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the minister if there's if the government would look at I can't think of a term where individuals are going to subsidies. That's what I'm looking for. I was wondering if there would be any subsidies based on the remoteness of the communities, or maybe based on income, or maybe based on the fact that individuals are hunting for elders and so on. If there would be any subsidies at all involved in this whole carbon tax scheme. Thank you.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as members are aware, this Legislative Assembly of the Government of the Northwest Territory does provide a lot of subsidies across the N.W.T. A couple of things that the member mentioned on hunting through and trapping, and that through the different programs that are offered through ENR and the Genuine Fur Valley, the Grub Stake program. There's, they do get some funding through that. So, as far as coming up with another subsidy, that's not on the table. At the moment, as I said again, there's a number of subsidies that are provided through the government, and we believe that through one of the subsidies might be able to capture the issue that the member is speaking of. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Canada Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions will be for the Minister responsible for housing. The corporation has this great program called HELP, and it helps people get into their homes and become homeowners, and I think it's a great program. However, recently I've been advised that there was applications, there was 4 applicants for 4 units in the community of Fort Simpson. Two candidates were very successful. I'm very happy to hear that. However, one of the other 2 are competing now for only 1 unit because they've turned in one of the help units into the market house renting. So can the minister explain why they changed one of the help units into a market rent unit? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, it would be inappropriate for me to discuss any specific application and information on our residents here. But if there is no program demand for a particular unit and it does remain vacant, the N.W.T Housing Corporation can reprofile a help unit into a market unit, or vice versa. We can turn a market unit into a help unit, but it would be inappropriate for me to discuss any specifics on any kind of application information. But if there, like I said, if there's no program demand, then we're able to reprofile those units. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't asking about applicants. I'm just saying that I know that there was 4 applicants, 4 help units. So again, what was the rationale to reduce that one, take one of those house help units to a market unit? Because there's 2 applicants looking for you know, these type of units. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I mentioned earlier, units are not profiled to another program unless it is confirmed that there's no demand for the unit under the original program, and that's what was the case in the sense. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tada Kasi member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If there's 4 applicants, there's 4 help units, I would assume there's a need. So unfortunately, I guess the corporation has a different matrix of deciding what needs are. So it's my understanding the Housing Corporation is bringing in 2 more units during the winter months. Are these units going to be help units or market rent units? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The member is correct. We are bringing in 2 market rental duplexes, which equates to 4 units. These should be ready for occupancy, hopefully by March of 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Kasi member Nehende.
Mr. Speaker, and that's great news, and I thank the Minister for providing that here today. With these new units coming into place, will that unit they change from help to market be turned back to a help unit so residents can have that opportunity to get into this program? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the introduction of more help units into any community across the Northwest Territories are only considered if there is a demand for the program. Obviously, N.W.T. Housing Corporation would like to work with residents to get into home ownership or work with them to get into housing units. But the same is for market units. You know, we have nurses, we have teachers out there that need units to stay in, and we need to find a fine balance. But the introduction of any help units across the N.W.T. would be considered if there was demand for the program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Hikade Cannon, the member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of my constituents is a trapper who benefits from the ENR's prime fur bonus program. And over the last season, he had substantial delays in receiving his payment, thousands of dollars held up for inexplicable reason. Now, I brought this concern to the Minister of ENR, and it has since been resolved. But I'm wondering if he can speak publicly to the issue, which is affecting the prompt payment of our trappers who rely on this extra income. Thank you.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would be happy to stand here and promote one of the best programs that the government offers across the Northwest Territories. And as a member from Mackenzie Delta said, it is November 1st today, trapping season, and a lot of people are able to access many of the programs through the grub stake program and prepare themselves for an upcoming trapping season. And they get fur advances when they bring their fur in. They do get an advance on the fur that they bring. They send the fur out to the markets, and then depending on how quickly the sale is how quickly we can get the money back to them. I was glad we were able to resolve the members' constituents' issue, but it is a very successful program. And I'm going on a little too long, so I'm going to stop there, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nakeda Kasi member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with the Minister. It's a great program, but it's really important that we pay our trappers on time. And I know that with my constituent in particular, there was a new financial system that was put in place that was the subject of these delays. And I know at the time that I inquired with this, the department was still working out the kinks. I don't want to see a Phoenix pay system in the N.W.T. sort of problem, and I don't think any of our trappers do either. So can the Minister assure this House that this new financial system is working as intended, and after this season, there'll be no more delays in payments? Thank you.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, the fur harvest management system might be the one the member is referring to. We are getting the kinks out of that. Again, I would have to investigate a little further, but I do know that sometimes the delay in getting the money back to the trappers is from the actual fur sale itself. But I think in this particular case, the way that it was going through the system might have been part of the reason for the delay, and I can assure the member and all trappers out there, and I know a lot of them personally, that this won't be happening again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadadakasi, member Cam Lake.
Has the minister's department reached out to all these trappers who who were delayed in getting paid? Has the minister's department reached out and let them know what the issues are, and let them know and can reassure them personally that the problem will not happen again? Thank you.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my understanding, as far as I know, we've had the one concern, and if there are others, I will follow up and let them know that this shouldn't happen again once we get all the kinks ironed out of the system. Again, a member agrees with me. This is a fantastic program. We actually had a veteran trapper up in the Delta when we were up there with the meeting on the economic symposium we had there. Actually come up to Minister of ITI and myself, complimenting the government on the success of that program with the grub stake program and everything else, and how successful it's been, and how many trappers have actually taken advantage of this program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, County, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment. I referred to the announcement this week of an additional $1.8 million over 4 years under the new government greenhouse gas grant program. And I note that this program is aimed at government's reductions of greenhouse gas outputs from non-renewable energy sources. My question for the Minister is, can he tell me why a decision was made to introduce programming that in the end perpetuates fossil fuel use rather than devoting more substantial funds to these government's introductions of fully renewable energy systems? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we developed the 2030 energy strategy, we had to go out and have a look at everything and talk to everybody and have consultation about what residents felt that was important to them across all lengths of government and people in the Northwest Territories. And this was one of the programs and many that we're introducing in the 2030 energy strategy that needed to be looked at. And it was felt that this needed to be funded in this manner, so that's one of the decisions that came out of that process. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Masi, Mr. Speaker, thanks to the Minister for that. The question that I have is how the Minister balances the need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions versus replacing fossil fuel use altogether. How is that balance determined? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we went up and did our consultation, it was clearly stated that we need to have a secure, safe, reliable source of energy. Technology isn't there to switch to renewables for us, and particularly because we have such a vast territory that we have to have fuel into some of these smaller communities such as Sax and Uluwaktuk and Polituk, which is a challenging environment. That's why we're doing our wind studies up in that type of environment to see if it's feasible. So we have to balance this up. Technology isn't there to totally get us off of fossil fuels and into renewables. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tadadakasi, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, under the N.W.T's carbon pricing scheme, the large industrial producers of greenhouse gas will get 75% of their taxes rebated, 25% goes into a special fund. I truly believe that industry will take more aggressive action on reducing its greenhouse gas emissions and replacing fossil fuel if they were asked. So in developing this element of the plan, what evaluation was made of how less rebate and more project support would influence industry to make these changes? Masi.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know that the large industry emission people in the Northwest Territories is a mining industry. These people are already located in a situation where they're off the road system, they're off a hydro. They have to make their most efficient operation they possibly can to keep their costs down. This fund we set up, the 75-25, is going to be able to help them come up with new types of approaches to be able to get them off of fossil fuels. And it's a balanced approach that, like I've said, we've had to do across the Northwest Territories, and the mining industry is a big part of helping us try to come to some type of solution, but they're trying to mitigate their costs and what they're doing presently. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Kasi member, Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that. Finally, I note that recently announced spending under the Federal Territorial Low Carbon Leadership Fund provides support for carbon sequestration in forestry. This would hardly seem to me to be a priority against the more pressing needs of, say, aggressively improving the energy efficiency of government housing stock. So can the Minister explain why the emphasis was put on sequestration rather than, again, it's the balance thing, but on sequestration rather than energy improvements to public housing? Thank you.
Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Low Carbon Economy Leadership Fund does have money in there for helping to gain efficiency in public housing. There's a significant amount in there. We've had to take a balanced approach to this whole aspect of how we're going to lower greenhouse gas emissions in the Northwest Territories. But the other side of it is, on these applications, there's certain criteria that we have to fulfill to meet federal funding. And to be able to access some of this money, we've had to spread it around and tried to help all parts of the economy in the Northwest Territories. And this is one of the ones that's come forward, and we are working with ENR on that to move the carbon sequestration forward for reforestation. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. The member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I was asking the Housing Minister, or Minister responsible for housing, he said that the corporation demand, he was talking about the demand and need of help units in the community. So can the Minister provide what the corporation definition is, the demand for help units in the communities? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And when we look at the demand in our communities, we look at what the priorities are of the region. And as I mentioned over this session, one of the initiatives that we are taking on as a housing corporation and working with the communities, and you heard in my minister's statement earlier, is we're going to be developing these community housing plans. And we're going to be working with leadership, we're going to be working with stakeholders to identify these. In the situation and questions that the member has asked earlier, we had to make some changes within in the community to meet some of the market units. As you know, as all members here know, there's low market units for teachers, for nurses, for professionals to have a place to stay and provide the services that our residents need in the Northwest Territories. The housing plan is going to address that. When we work with our communities, we're going to develop a comprehensive strategic planning document that's going to say whether or not homelessness is the priority, seniors are the priority, singles units, or market units, and we're going to work with every community across the Northwest Territories. We're going to find northern solutions for our northern housing needs. And one other program that I just want to put out there, Mr. Speaker, is our Community Housing Support Initiative. We're working very well with communities to address the housing needs that they have. And it's a really good program, and I encourage all members to take a look into it. We're developing some really good programs, and we're developing some very strong partnerships. So I'd ask the member to reach out to us and maybe have their leadership have a discussion with our staff to see how we can address some of the concerns that the member does have in addressing whether it's a help unit or market unit or public housing units in the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question that Kirare, Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. So we're talking about housing, community housing plans and that, and we're going to do 6 in the next year coming up. So can you tell me when Fort Simpson is going to be on that list? Because if we're going to be waiting 6, 12, 14, 2 years from now, I'd like to know that so the community can know that, because right now, now the housing corporations are relying on these community housing plans. So can the Minister advise us when Fort Simpson will be on that list? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this moment in time, I don't have a timeline for when Fort Simpson will get on that list. We have put it out there. As I mentioned in my statement, we have Indigenous governments that are seeking interest into developing these community housing plans. Community of N.W.T. for one is a community that we're going to start with. This is new. This is new to government. It's new to the N.W.T. Housing Corporation. As we start to develop it, and I've said this time and time again during the session, that once we get a housing plan up and running, it might show as a template for similar communities across the Northwest Territories. So I think that as we move forward and we start developing these housing plans throughout the Northwest Territories, hopefully it'll steamroll so that all communities will eventually get on board and we'll develop some community housing plans for all of our communities in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question Tadare, Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've heard the words may, hope, could be the template. So if it isn't the template, what are these communities supposed to be doing in the short term? Because right now, we're looking at market help units being turned into market units, and we're bringing in market units into the community, and I also know some private industries are bringing in market units in there. So what are the communities supposed to do if it's not fitting model, the template that they're working for? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the N.W.T. Housing Corporation has gone through a significant change over the last during the 17th and the 18th Legislative Assembly. We've developed some great programs that are helping communities, that are helping families, and we're going to continue to promote those programs. I encourage communities, I encourage members, I encourage residents to go and speak to their local housing offices. Also go and speak with the regional district offices on how those programs can help and benefit a community. We have a lot of programs that are very successful. We've gone, like I mentioned, we've gone through a change over the last 2 governments. In terms of private industry, we're more than open to work with private industry to adjust the housing needs in some of our communities and regional centers, and we'll continue to promote that. Partnership within the N.W.T. Housing Corporation is significant, and we pride ourselves on that. We've shown success with Indigenous governments. We've shown success with private industry. The Invaluable Corporation is a really good benchmark that we can look at as a standard. And so in the meantime, I think we've done a lot in the last 2 governments to address the housing needs across the Northwest Territories. We'll continue to do that and encourage the member and leadership in the Nehende riding to reach out to our district office, and if not, we can make sure our district office reaches out to leadership. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nondere, Council Member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Wow, I'm stumped for words here because, first of all, I've never ever said anything bad about the regional associate or the district office. They've done a great job. They're promoting the information out there. They're getting there. But what I'm seeing is that the Housing Corporation has changed a help unit to a market rental unit. We're bringing in more market rental units in. And people are still looking for help units. Is this government taking away the help units then? Is this no longer going to be an option for people in the future? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just for the record, I didn't say the member had said anything bad about our regional district offices, so I don't know where you got that from. Secondly, we continue to promote our programs in the Housing Corporation that have been having an impact in all our communities across the Northwest Territories. In terms of help units, I answered the question earlier. It's based on demand for the program, and if the demand's not there, then we're going to turn it into a market rent unit, and vice versa. If the market unit's there and it's not being used, we'll turn it into a help unit. And some of these programs are application-based, so it's really based on the application and whether or not residents meet those criteria for the application. So once again, I apologize if I came off anyway saying that the member had mentioned anything bad about the regional office, but I don't believe I did. But I just wanted to put that out there. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker's follow-up to my member's statement on the trapping season, I'd like to ask the minister responsible for ENR if they could share the numbers. Like, you know, many of us here have Facebook accounts, and we see all the nice pictures people put on, whether it's trapping, hunting, but you know, I've seen in my riding a number of young people starting to get into trapping. So can the minister share numbers from the last trapping season on the number of trappers, if they've seen an increase or decrease? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from November 2017 to June 2018, which was basically the trapping season, there were 661 trappers in the Northwest Territories, and they marketed about $622,000 of northern fur for that particular year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know many of my constituents, especially the ones that go out ratting, bring in a lot of furs, and just have a question. I'd like to get an update on the uptake on the grub stake program. I know this territory is a leader that is pretty much the only territory, or none of the provinces that I know of have a grub stake program similar to ours. So just a little update from the minister on that program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As far as I know, we're the only jurisdiction in the country that offers a grub stake program as far as traditional fur harvesting goes, and we're quite proud of that fact. We recognize the fact that it is an important economy in the Northwest Territories, and members are absolutely correct. You're starting to see more and more young people get back into the traditional lifestyle, and there's a lot of support from the government, and as well as I know of a couple of Aboriginal governments. I think the GTC has a great program where they support the young people that are trying to get back into trapping. Last year, Trap and Grub Stake program allocated a total of $101,000 for the current 2018-19 fiscal year, and trapping year, and we have it broken down by regions as well. I think in the Bodell, last year there was about $34,000 that was allocated through the grub stake program. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the department has started a new initiative in the Mackenzie Delta, especially in Klavik and Uvik, with harvesting of beaver this past spring here, and it was very, very productive. You know, the community seen over 100,000 brought into the community of Aklavik alone, or the communities that were a part of this. It wasn't cash into the communities, but it was money that went into cards, whether it was to the local northern store. So on that note, on the land collaborative, how many projects, and how was this paid out? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the program that the member spoke about, I think I was in collaboration with the Aboriginal governments up there. I think IRC was heavily involved in that, and my understanding was a fairly successful program. As far as the On the Land Collaborative, we received a number of applications. I think there was about 104 applications, but 48 projects were approved, and approximately $1 million was dispersed to support on the land programming. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, no direct member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just, you know, while we're on this topic, you know, I know in the past, even myself, I've attended a couple of trapping workshops, and you know, it's always good to show our up-and-coming trappers new techniques and ways to set traps. Does the department plan to hold any more trapping workshops this winter? I know a number of people have been asking about how to get traps in communities, especially the ones that don't have any hardware stores or anywhere to get them actually in town. So is the department planning to have any trapping workshops this winter? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as far as the actual workshops, I'm not quite sure of that detail, but I will commit to getting that detail to see when and where we're having any workshops that are going out. And then I think the department is also coming forward to this assembly, I believe, soon with the new initiative that they'd like to try. I will not speak of it now, but it'll be brought up before this assembly as we deliberate the O&M budget during February, March, and I think folks out there will be pleased with the new initiatives that are coming out through ENR. But I will find the information on the actual workshops and where they have them. I take the member's point. I believe that they have had workshops in the past where they teach them how to prepare their furs properly to get the best prices for them, and trappers were appreciative of that, because any little course you take, you gain some valuable experience out of it and increase your knowledge a bit. So I will find out and share it with the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this set of questions is for the Minister of Health and Social Services. Last winter, we discussed the availability of family planning tools, such as birth control and the medication that terminates an early-stage pregnancy called mifepristone. At that time, the Minister said his department was reviewing gaps in supplementary health benefits. Can the Minister update the House on the progress of this review as it relates to family planning? Merci.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the review of the sub-health program is in relation to all coverage for all types of things, including the things the member has described. That review is going to take some time. It will likely go into the next government and be something the next government is going to have to make some hard decisions on. We did have a brief chat this morning, and I did confirm that to the member, but since then I haven't had an opportunity to talk to the department, and taking the member's point that waiting that long could be problematic for many women. I have issued a directive to the Department of Health and Social Service to put in some interim measures to cover the treatment or the mifepristone on an interim basis until the conclusion of the sub-health review. This means that it will be a payment of last resort and that individuals must use either NIHB, extended health benefits, Métis health benefits, and an insurance if they have it through their employer, or indigent health benefits. So basically, low-income families or low-income workers who don't have insurance will be covered once this directive goes into place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister taking proactive action on this. The other issue that we talked about last winter was exploring options to make the pill available in regional health centres. Has there been any progress on making this service available outside of Yellowknife? Mussey.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
There has been progress, Mr. Speaker, but not enough. One of the challenges that we're facing is the diagnostic steps that need to be taken before the pill can be issued or prescribed. We're having some complications making sure that can happen at a regional level, but I commit to the member that we will continue to do that work, and we will make sure that this is available through the NOW program to all residents of the Northwest Territories. It will take a bit more time to make that happen. Thank you.
Oral question, Tadade Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Minister's efforts. Could he give us any proposed timing for resolving those issues? I guess at this point the question is it during the life of this Assembly or will it be deferred till the next one? Thank you.
Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after our conversation this morning, I did talk to the department and issue that directive. I did tell them that I wanted this other issue resolved as quickly as possible. There are a few technical issues we have to work through. They said they would get me a timeline on how long they think it might take, but I directed and indicated I want to see it happen in the life of this government and not dragged out into the life of the next. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Not on that.
Oral questions. Nundere Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for letting me clear out my closet of extra questions. This time, my questions are for the Minister of Infrastructure. The N.W.T invested millions of dollars to construct a new office building in my riding, and this building has been open for several years, and it's called, very glamorously, the New Government Building, or the NGB for short. Several constituents have approached me with names for this building, and my question for the Minister is, when will the Minister begin the process of finding a proper name for the NGB? Thank you.
Mussey. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That policy actually doesn't lie with me just because infrastructure built the building and we have some of our staff in there. That policy of naming a building actually lies with the EIA, with the Premier's Office, the Executive. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mussey. Oral question, Nakita Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Minister's information. My question for the Premier is, when will the Minister begin the process of finding a proper name for the NGB? Thank you.
Minister of Infrastructure.
I'm not the Premier. Let's get that straight. That question would have to be redirected to the Premier, and I can gladly have a conversation with the Premier after sitting and see how we're going to move on that, if we are moving on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade Cassie, member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier, and it's about finding a new name for the NGB. Could the Premier please review the policy that he is going to follow for finding a name for this building? Thank you.
I'd like to remind members that when you direct a certain question to a minister, we stick to that minister unless the Premier allows other ministers to respond. So at this point in time, I will allow ITI, no infrastructure minister, to continue. Minister of Infrastructure.
What was the question? I don't remember. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will have a look at the policy and get back to the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Tada Cassie, member Yellowknife Center.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a process question. May I now ask my questions to the Premier as a separate set of questions? Massey? No. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Massey. Depending on the time, we still have some time, so I'll go through other members as well. Oral question, the member Nehende.
Mr. Speaker, and I hope I get the questions to the right minister here. I think this is towards the Minister of Infrastructure. Recently, I was been advised of a sole source contract that seems to be a little bit out of the ordinary, and I'm looking for some clarification. Can the Minister of Infrastructure advise this House if the department has entered into a sole source contract with Imperial Oil for providing fuel for the communities that rely on N.W.T? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, the department has entered into a sole source contract for a period of 3 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the minister's answer. He sort of kind of took part of my answer there. Next question, but can the minister advise this House how much the sole source contract was worth for this 3-year period? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The term of the contract was 3 years, has a value of approximately $54 million, depending on the volume of fuel that is required to resupply the communities by barge. It should be noted that either party can terminate the contract with proper notice, and the N.W.T has saved approximately $600,000 per year with this contract. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tada Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the Minister for providing that answer to us here today, and a little bit more information as well. It was very helpful. Can the Minister explain why the contract was not sent out for a tender process, and if he reached out to other northern businesses to see if they're able to deal with this contract? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2016, the department issued a tender for a resupply of fuel, and Imperial Oil was the only company that submitted a bid because Imperial Oil is the only company in Hay River that owns the infrastructure to safely unload from rail to cars into the barges. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member Nehende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, there seems to be a large amount of money to be sole sourced. I've looked at the Financial Administration Act, and I know the Executive Council may, on behalf of the government, authorize contracts authorized to enter into a contract that falls within a class of contracts. However, the Executive Council must record its reasons for authorized contract entered into these things. So can the Minister advise how he was able to enter a sole source contract for this type of huge amount of money, and if it was there was a record of decision? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The department has the authority to enter into the sole source contract, and it was posted and recorded onto the Government of Northwest Territories e-procurement website. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Oral questions. Member for Nehende. Sorry. Member for Trinidad-Willowdale.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, just caught me a bit off guard. I was trying to send a note to the Minister of Infrastructure. You didn't get it yet. Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to ask a general question. I like to have that, try to provide a little more detail on what I'm trying to get to. But Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the minister if the minister has any flexibility on large tenders. And what I'm asking is if the flexibility would be if the two bids were very close, and there's this southern bid with the full application of any BIP or anything that would be, and the southern bid was just marginally out. I guess had more points, was low enough that that the northern bidder would be close enough, but not within the policy. So I'd like to ask the minister if something was that close for the benefit of the north. To keep the money in the north, if the minister has flexibility to change, to decide to go with a northern bidder. Thank you.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Couldn't get you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When we put large projects, particularly projects over $1 million out to bid, there's criteria that's followed through the BIP policy and procurement policy. There's a number of adjustments that are made in there for northern businesses, besides local bid, BIP companies, and then there's content for N.W.T, labor force, N.W.T procurement within that contract. So there's a number of adjustments that are already put into place that give the Northwest Territories a little bit of an advantage over a southern contractor. And these things are put into place to give us to be able to leverage northern companies to be able to compete with big southern companies who want to bid on some of these projects. So if there was a southern company that came in lower than a northern company with that bid content, I am not going to go, and I don't think our financial administration policy is going to let us go there and just change the bid to give a northern company the edge over it because they were a little bit higher than the southern company. There's a process that's laid out, and there's a number of policies and procedures put into place to help us leverage that content for northern procurement and businesses to take advantage of that, and we have to stick to that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Akira Cassie member Trinidad.
Mr. Speaker, I realize that there's been adjustments to the BIP policy. I'd like to ask the minister if there would be any consideration to increasing that the lower threshold. Like right now, my understanding is that at about $1 million, you could have a 15% advantage, 20% advantage. But once you get over that, then I think the preference is minor. Preference maybe 3%, 2%, or a very low percentage at the end of the day. I'd like to ask the minister if he would consider again looking at that to increase that amount to try to ensure that the money stays in the north. Right now, the northern companies need work, and as the current policy lies, it's easy for a southern company to bid low enough to beat out northern companies that maybe have higher operating costs by being up here. Thank you.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I think to lighten the mood, it's our last day in the House. We always say the BIP policy is the best policy in the government of Northwest Territories, but the Minister of ENR tells me the grub stake program is the best policy of the Northwest Territories. I think one of the things I think that I would possibly consider that would give me a little more flexibility is on some of these large projects, particularly through infrastructure, is I can have a look at some of these bigger projects and looking if there's a way to split them up to make them not so big, maybe break them down into a smaller contracts, and that's something that I can endeavor to do, especially when we're rolling out some of this new money that we've got coming. And that would give us, a little bit more of an advantage, because I think some of the questions that come around some of these bigger projects is people always say business is slow in the south and they're starting to look north. And that could be the case, but we still have to, our northern businesses have to be competitive. We got to have value for money, and we got to have a balance of what we're doing. But I could certainly have a look at some of these bigger contracts, particularly around some of the infrastructure stuff, and maybe looking at maybe breaking out some of these things to make them smaller pieces. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tada Cassie member Trinidad.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, and the minister's idea about debundling, I think is a good idea. I would like to ask the minister if he was to debundle a project, for example, of something that's worth $10 million debundled into 2 or 3 projects. If the smaller the bundles are, the better opportunities there are for northern companies. So I'd like to ask the minister if we could break the bundles down to a point where it gives the best advantage to northern companies. Thank you.
Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, I think that's something I can certainly have a look at. There still has to be value for money. We can't have tailored everything to just northern businesses. We got to have value for money because the competitive processes allows for the best price to come forward for the government of Northwest Territories, ultimately the taxpayers and residents of the N.W.T. But I can certainly have a look at some of these projects of concern. It's just taking a highway contract, for example, possibly maybe breaking out the crushing totally separate from maybe the whole project, being crushing to drainage to embankment to all these types of things, to bring these projects to a little bit smaller scale that where N.W.T. businesses will have a little more competitive advantage versus a fully bundled project. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question. No dire Council Member Trinity Walladay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this interesting answer from the minister. The minister talked about maybe an idea of debundling crushing. So, if that is the case, does the minister see something like crushing material for a highway as northern manufacturing? Is it something that adds added value for the Northwest Territories? So would crushing be considered a northern manufactured product? Thank you.
Masi. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's a definition for northern manufacturers, and I don't believe crushing fits under that criteria. I can certainly check with the department, but I don't believe that that falls under there. In fact, I believe some people have already asked to submit that and asked if that was a manufactured product. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral questions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you for your patience. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Premier and Minister of Executive and Indigenous Affairs. The N.W.T. has invested millions of dollars to construct a new office building in my riding. The building has been open for several years, and it is called the New Government Building, or the NGB. Several constituents have approached me with names for this building. My question is, when will the Premier begin the process of finding a proper name for this building? Masi.
Masi. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I kind of like that NGB name itself. Generally, we respond to public interest, so if there is public interest to name the building, we have a government policy that focuses on 2 areas when it comes to naming of buildings. One aspect is to how to set up a process that is fair and gives everybody that is interested in submitting a name an opportunity to do so. And also we have some criteria as to what types of names. For example, we're not going to name buildings after people that are alive, for example. So that's the kind of criteria. But if there's indication of public interest, we'd be more than pleased to look at doing so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Building face.
Masi. Oral question. Akida Kasi Member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate that answer. So how do I, or how does this process work in terms of getting these expressions of interest, which I've received informally about finding a proper name, into the process the Premier just described? Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm told that we are starting a process that will provide for the naming of the NGB building, and I think that'll be out shortly. And I said we will probably, the authority to set up the process and to approve the name of a new building lies with Cabinet, and I think we would want to make sure that the names that are submitted are respectful. I think in England, where they had a naming contest for a new boat, and they came up with Bodie McBoatface or something. So we would want to try to come up with a fair process that comes up with a respectful name. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, Tadade Cassie, member, Young Life Center.
Must Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I can appreciate building McBuilding would not be a great outcome of this process. But I do understand that there is some criteria. Other than the fact that the person cannot be alive, can the Premier tell us anything else about the criteria for naming? Masi.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll circulate the policy for naming of buildings. I know there's NGB buildings in other communities as well, so we'll make sure that information is available. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie, member, Young Life Center.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Premier for that. So does the Premier envision this process being complete in the life of this Assembly? Masi.
Masi. The Honourable Premier.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had a number of suggestions for naming of buildings, and so for that reason we came up with a government policy. We have the policy as a definition for an office building. The definition is based on the purpose of the building. Some of the guidelines is we need Cabinet approval. We'll consider whether the proposed name reflects the historical, cultural, and geographical significance of the Northwest Territories. N.W.T. owned office buildings may be named in honor of deceased persons who have made significant contributions to public life. And N.W.T. owned office buildings will not be named in honor of living persons, as I said. And we may approve a public engagement process to solicit naming ideas for N.W.T. owned office buildings. So we would endeavor to enter into that process for the buildings that the member has raised. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question, written questions. Written questions, returns to written questions. Returns to written questions, replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports to Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports of Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to table the following two documents entitled Grants and Contribution Results Report 2017-2018 and Energy Initiatives Report 2017-2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Tabling of documents. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 23(2) of the N.W.T. Housing Corporation Act, I wish to table the following document entitled Northwest Territories Housing Corporation Annual Report 2017-2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Sections 32(2) of the Financial Administration Act, I wish to table the following 4 documents entitled N.W.T Health and Social Services Authority 2017-18 Annual Report, the Annual Report 2017-18 of the N.W.T Health and Social Services System, Toledo Community Services Agency Health and Social Services Annual Report 2017-18, and the Annual Report 2017-18 for the Hay River Health and Social Services Authority. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 74(3) and 35(1) of the Financial Administration Act, I wish to table the following 2 heavy documents entitled Interactivity Transfers exceeding $250,000, April 1st, 2018 to June 30th, 2018, and Public Accounts 2017-2018, Sections 1, 2, 3, and 4. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Pursuant to Section 32(2) of the Financial Administration Act, I wish to table the following 2 also heavy documents entitled Annual Reports for Northwest Territories Education Bodies for the 2017-18 school year ending June 30th, 2018, and Operating Plans for Northwest Territories Education Bodies for the 2018-2019 school year ending June 30th, 2019. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, earlier this sitting, I tabled the annual report on the activities of the rental officer. The Department of Justice has found an error in the document on pages 8 and 20 of the report. The English portion overstated the value of monetary compensation orders in 2018 as $7.3 million instead of the correct number of $1.7 million. This error was made by the department in the completion of the document and not by the rental officer in their submission of the report. With that, Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 74.2 in brackets 2 of the Residential Tenancies Act, I wish to table annual report on the activities of the rental officer April 1, 2017 to March 31, 2018. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Member for Trinity-Willowday.
Mr. Speaker, I have 2 documents to table. The first is a letter from the Native Women's Association at N.W.T. that was written to the Honourable Member, the Honourable Glenn Abernathy, Minister of Health and Social Services. And the second is a petition that doesn't meet all of the guidelines of a petition to be tabled. So I'm presenting this as a letter from the Dinunaquan First Nations to the Honourable Minister Abernathy, Department of Health and Social Services on the for resolution Great Elders Facility. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Notices of motion for first reading bills. Motions. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Mr. Speaker, whereas Section 21, brackets 1 of the Territorial Emblems and Honours Act provides for the creation of the Northwest Territories Honours Advisory Council to review nominations and recommend appointments to the Order of the Northwest Territories, and whereas in May 2018 the following members were appointed to the Northwest Territories Honours Advisory Council: Ms. Sabrina Broadhead of Hay River, Mr. Danny Gaudette of Delaney, and Ms. Ann Peters of Yellowknife. And whereas Section 23, brackets 1 of the Territories Emblem and Honors Act provides that the Legislative Assembly, on the recommendation of the Board of Management, shall designate a member of the Council as chairperson of the Council. Now therefore I move, second by the Honourable Member for Hay River South, that Mr. Danny Gaudette of Delaney be appointed as Chair of the Northwest Territories Honours Advisory Council. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Motions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, whereas the Consensus Government Process Convention on Priority Setting and Reporting calls for the establishment of a special committee on transition matters, and whereas transition to a new assembly is an appropriate time for reporting on matters of ongoing action, discussion, and consideration, and whereas members of the 19th Legislative Assembly may wish to consider how to build on the direction and deliberations of the 18th Legislative Assembly, now therefore I move, seconded by the Honourable Member of Thabaja, that pursuant to Rule 92.1, the Legislative Assembly hereby establish a special committee on transition matters, and further that the following members be named to the special committee. The member for Hay River North, Mr. R.J. Simpson, Chair. The member for Frame Lake, Mr. Kevin O'Reilly. The member for Great Slave, Mr. Glenn Abernathy. The member for Hay River South, Mr. Wally Schumann. The member for Cam Lake, Mr. Kieran Testart. And the member for Nahende, Mr. Shane Thompson. And furthermore, that the Special Committee on Transition Matters be established by the terms of reference identified as Table Document 277-18-3. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. The motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Motions. Member for Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, whereas Section 48(1) of the Human Rights Act provides for the establishment of an adjudication panel composed of at least 3 persons appointed by the Commissioner on the recommendation of the Legislative Assembly, and whereas Section 48(4) of the Human Rights Act provides that the members of the panel hold office during good behavior for a term of 4 years, with the exception of the first members appointed, and whereas on November 2nd, 2018, there will be 1 vacancy on the adjudication panel, and whereas the Board of Management is tasked with recommending individuals to the Legislative Assembly, and the Legislative Assembly is prepared to make a recommendation to the Commissioner, now therefore I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Hay River South, that Mr. Colin Bale of Yellowknife be recommended to the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories for reappointment as a member of the Human Rights Adjudication Panel, effective immediately for a term of 4 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Motions. Member for Inuvik-Twin Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, whereas the members of the 18th Legislative Assembly agreed upon a priority support initiative designed to increase the number of women running for elected office in the Northwest Territories, and whereas on March 8, 2018, a motion was adopted by the Legislative Assembly establishing a goal of increasing the representation of women in the Legislative Assembly by 20% by 2023 and 30% by 2027. And whereas on May 31st, 2018, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly tabled a discussion paper on temporary special measures to increase the representation of women in the N.W.T. Legislative Assembly. Now therefore I move, second by the Honourable Member for Nahende, that pursuant to Rule 92(1), the Legislative Assembly hereby establish a special committee to increase the representation of women in the Legislative Assembly, and further that the following members be named to that special committee. The member for Yellowknife Centre, Ms. Julie Green, Chair. The member for Daicho, Mr. Michael Natalie. The member for Nanakput, Mr. Herbert Nekamayak. The member for Range Lake, Ms. Carolyn Cochran. The member for Thabacha, Mr. Louis Siebert. And the member for Tunaday-Willaday, Mr. Tom Bolio. And further, that the special committee to increase the representation of women in the Legislative Assembly be established by the terms of reference identified as table document 278-18 bracket 3. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. To the motion. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Motions. Member for Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whereas Section 16, brackets 2 of the Human Rights Act provides that the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission is composed of such members between 3 and 5 in number, as may be appointed by the Commissioner on the recommendation of the Legislative Assembly. And whereas on November 2nd, 2018, there will be 2 vacancies on the Commission. And whereas the Board of Management is tasked with recommending individuals of the to the Legislative Assembly, and to the Legislative Assembly is prepared to make recommendation to the Commissioner. Now therefore I move, second by the Honourable Member for Haverhill South, that Mr. Yakub Adam of Yellowknife be recommended to the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories for reappointment as a member of the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission, effective immediately for a term of 4 years. And further, that Ms. Jerry Sharp of Yellowknife be recommended to the Commissioner of the Northwest Territories for reappointment as a member of the Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission, effective immediately for a term of 4 years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. To the motion. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Motions. Member for Yellowknife Centre.
I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for Great Slave, that notwithstanding Rule 4, when this House adjourns on November 1st, 2018, it shall be adjourned until Tuesday, February the 5th, 2019. And further, that at any time prior to February 5th, 2019, if the Speaker is satisfied after consultation with the Executive Council and members of the Legislative Assembly that the public interest requires that the House should meet at an earlier time during the adjournment, the Speaker may give notice, and thereupon the House shall meet at the time stated in such notice and shall transact its business as it has been duly adjourned to that time. Mr. Speaker.
Motions in order. To the motion. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, second by the Honourable Member for Range Lake, that Bill 31, Northwest Territories 911 Act, be read for the second time. The bill directs the Minister of Municipal and Community Affairs to establish the N.W.T 911 service, a service for receiving and transferring emergency calls within the N.W.T. The bill binds the Government of the Northwest Territories and mandates the participation of telecommunications carriers, local authorities, and emergency service providers in the N.W.T 911 service. The bill establishes a 911 cost recovery fee and requires every local subscriber to a telephone service to pay the fee. Telecommunication carriers are required to comply with any prescribed registration and reporting requirements and to bill subscribers, collect the fee, and remit the fee to the Government of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Motions in order. To the principle of the bill. Questions been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 31 has had a second reading. Is now referred to the Standing Committee. Second reading of bills. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for Range Lake, that Bill 32, the Naturopathic Professions Statutes Amendment Act, be read for the second time. This bill amends various statutes administered by the Department of Health and Social Services to allow for the passage of regulations regulating the naturopathic doctor profession in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. The motion's in order to the principle of the bill. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Bill 32 has had a second reading. Is now referred to a standing committee. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of the Whole Bills and Other Matters. Minister Statement 19-18-3. Minister Statement 103-18-3 with Member Hay River North in the chair.
Now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, committee would like to consider Minister Statement 19-18(3), Aurora College Foundation Review Process. Minister Statement 103-18(3), Marine Transportation Services. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. We have agreed to consider Minister Statement 19-18(3). I will open up the floor to comments. Seeing none, does committee agree this concludes our consideration of Minister Statement 19-18(3), Aurora College Foundational Review Process? Thank you, committee. Next, we have agreed to consider Minister Statement 103-18(3), Marine Transportation Services. I'll open the floor to comments or questions from committee. Seeing none, does committee agree this concludes our consideration of Minister Statement 103-18(3), Marine Transportation Services? Thank you, committee. What is the wish of committee? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that the chair rise and report progress.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion to report progress. The motion is in order, non-debatable. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. I will rise and report progress.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering Minister Statement 19-18(3) and Minister Statement 103-18(3) and would like to report progress, and the consideration of Minister Statement 19-18(3) and Minister Statement 103-18(3) is concluded. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Do I have a seconder? Member for Yellowknife Center. Well, she's very excited today. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Massey. Third reading of bills. Minister of Justice.
I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River South, that Bill 20, Ombudsman Act, be read for the third time. And Mr. Speaker, I request a recorded vote. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member requested for a recorded vote. Motion's in order. To the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor, please stand.
The member for Tabacha, the member for Hay River North, the member for Mackenzie Delta, the member for Yellowknife North, the member for Cam Lake, the member for Tunadao-Weladay, the member for Nahende, the member for Yellowknife Centre, the member for Decho, the member for Nunakput, the member for Inuvik Boot Lake, the member for Range Lake, the member for Great Slave, the member for Yellowknife South, the member for Inuvik Twin Lakes, The member for Hay River South.
All those opposed, please stand. All those abstain, please stand. The results of the recorded vote, 16 in favor, 0 opposed, 0 abstention. Motion carried. Bill 20 has had its third reading. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, we ascertain that the Commissioner of Northwest Territories, the Honorable Margaret Tom, is ready to enter the chamber and to ascend bills.
Please be seated. Mr. Speaker and members of the Legislative Assembly, good afternoon. Fakultse kicho na henishi talaga na rahintaga sinie masi kunesu na haudati kunesu kwantine masi. It has been a while since I've been here in this great place. I'm thankful to see you all again in good health. Masi. Thank you. I would like to take a moment to encourage all residents to honor the dedication, proud service, and the many sacrifices made by current and past members of the Canadian Armed Force. Remembrance Day is on Sunday, November the 11th. I have been invited to Hay River this year to take part in their services, and I look forward to visiting for such an important occasion. As this sitting comes to an end, I would like to wish the members of this House good health, happiness, and prosperity as you enjoy the coming Christmas holiday season with your loved ones. I wish you all safe travels on the land, in the air, on the ice, and on our highways as you continue to work together cooperatively for the betterment of all the residents of the Northwest Territories. Now, as Commissioner of the Northwest Territories, I am pleased to assent to the following bills. Bill 7, Chartered Professional Accountants Act. Bill 8, Emergency Management Act. Bill 13, an act to amend the Securities Act. Bill 14, Miscellaneous Statute Law Amendment Act 2017. Bill 15, Document Formalization, Service and Notice Reform Statute Law Amendment Act. Bill 16, an act to amend the Social Assistance Act. Bill 17, an act to amend the Student Financial Assistance Act. Bill 18, an act to amend the Cities, Towns, and Villages Act. Bill 20, Ombuds Act. Bill 24, an act to amend the Elections and Plebiscites Act. Bill 27, Supplementary Appropriation Act, bracket, Infrastructure Expenditures, bracket, number 3, 2018-2019. Bill 28, Supplementary Appropriation Act, bracket, Operation Expenditures, bracket, number 3, 2018-2019. Bill 33, Appropriations Act, bracket, Infrastructure Expenditures 2019-2020. Masicho, thank you. Kwananani, merci beaucoup. Kwana.
Order.
Please be seated. Colleagues, I'd like to extend appreciation of this House to the Commissioner Margaret Tom. It was a pleasure to have her in the House today. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank all of the pages that have been with us who have served during our session here. Our youth are our future, as we always stated, our greatest resource. It is always a pleasure to have the youth as part of us in our chambers. I also like to thank the interpreters who have been with us throughout this session as well. They are Mero Sundberg, Margaret McKenzie, Berna Matto, Sarah Cleary, Tom Anka, and David Black. Thank you for all the services that you provide each and every day for us. Colleagues, our Indigenous language are not second class in a house. We are proud of our official languages, all the languages. We will continue to take measures to use and also celebrate our Indigenous language and to ensure that they are treated as equal to English and French. If we want to see our Indigenous languages grow and thrive throughout the territory, we must lead by example in this House. Finally, I would like to extend a special thank you to Gail Bennett for her assistance over the past 2 months. Gail, you always have a place at this table, and we truly, truly appreciate the expertise and dedication that you provide to us. Merci for that. And colleagues, during the past month, you have achieved a great deal and should be very proud of the work that you have done to date. I thank all of you for your continued dedication to this House, our form of consensus-style government, and to the people of the Northwest Territories. This House will not sit again until February. However, I know that you will be all busy with your constituency work in your communities, in your region, the committee work, the ongoing business of the government, and most importantly, your family and friends. I wish you safe travels as you return to your constituencies. Madam Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Tuesday, February 5th, 2019, 1:30 p.m. Hayat eti, Kabo de Hayati, Eketet Sodon Hayati, Standing Aid Zone, Special Committee Zone, Ami Godi Wetson, Idi, Kabo de Dawets Inke, Inle Godson Nagode, Haton Goga Gekwe Giji Hats Edi, Esti Wek Edzon Ats Ehi, Kabo de Dagets Eke, Nintle Ta, Da ets eke, indi niple da ets inke inle godson nagogede. Commissioner Wayati ke hayat eti goizi da asint eke. Nawode wego gida wegodi. Donate ala niple giga da ra negele. Nawo wekedzon ra yati nita. Akweshon nawo niple wekedzon ga hats edi. Nawon hosle, akweso, nawon nimple, wek eati, nanke, zon, nawon nimple, wek eati, nawon ala weron le geti, ra hoon, edani le ge adi, weron hagedi, taitson, nawon nimple, wek eati, indaidzen, edani le geti ha, wek eati.
Merci for that. Asik on in Ezina means it's ever good.
Very nice.
Merci. This House stands adjourned until Tuesday, February 5th, 2019 at 1:30 p.m.